live. What I'm doing is multitasking. I am walking, doing continuous training. I post while I walk. I walk over 10 miles per day, over several hours. I typically stay on ketosis at least 3/4 of the time throughout a month. This week, I do a 24-hour fast where I respect high fiber foods such as brown rice and lentils. And then I will walk. The first thing that I'll have usually is protein powder. I'll do 1 to 2 servings. In a couple of days, when my benefits kick in, I will be going back on ketosis, where I focus in on eggs and chicken. So this is kind of a surface or superficial aspect to me. And then I do these lives on different stations that I have, channels, if you will, that focus on the superficial aspects. That's Rogue Beast Warrior. To get more in depth with where I am, what I'm thinking, but in the process that it takes in order to achieve a leaner physique, but performance-based and performance orientation. I plan on getting a 360 cam along with some other equipment in the coming weeks and doing more performance-based recordings where I can talk about and conjecture the things that I have personal areas of interest in. Michael Levin, human cells that can be basically reprogrammed to heal the human body, and are called anthrobots, is a biological particular area of interest in a constructor theory sort of module where a physical form, right, instead of going back to like traditional physics. So in other words, if you can see the transient aspect of something that's not necessarily on running in existence, but it has a physical body enough to affect a change in a given compositional or even an alchemical solution, right? That through this, and this gets more into memetics, memetic chains being traditionally looked at as something that's like more amino acid based, right? Not exclusively, but it's the perfect example that you can trick the HPTA, particularly the hypothalamic pituitary testicular axis. You can trick an excretion to take place where the first 181 amino acid microfractions make it look like there's localized damage control being done, right? So the end all result being these insulin growth factors, but the initiating stage being growth hormone secretion, and how all the endocrine organs respond. But even more on a glandular scale, there's almost something primitive occurring there, right? That seems to be part and parcel linked up with the limbic system and the amygdala, right? And that it's almost like the nervous system, neurohormones, what is being relayed and conveyed to the nervous system is being manipulated from that base of a more, I'm going to say, a primordial response, right? Almost like a secondary plant metabolite, but that the higher mind, the will, if you will, the free will, that is always being, argued whether or not that exists. Well, this is the living proof. When you can do more than one thing, when you can articulate a movement pattern that becomes autogenic, and that's what happens when somebody is really good at what they do, to where they're doing this. I mean, there's even surgeons, right, working on a very intricate high scale that begin to know their jobs so well that they can communicate, talk, and even teach and lecture while they're doing their work, right? Same thing with computer programs, computer programmers, or computer scientists, right? When you come in contact with these people, particularly if you're in a particular field that requires very intricate, even mathematical precision in detail, and the subconscious just knows when it has erred or when it is doing something incorrectly, but it doesn't interrupt a personal expression or a trail of thought, because everything culminates from and goes back into the person as an entity has become a constructor, right? They are involved in a process, and they are not removed from the process that they are involved in, right? So there isn't anything superfluous added to that doesn't condone or create a conditional event, if that makes sense. So deviation, there's very little room for deviation, right? So somebody is not going to be trailing off into a subject that doesn't pertain directly to and correlate back into and feed back into every experience that someone has, every expression, every dialectical exchange feeds back into a knowledge base and the perpetuation of an actionable deed that really is what academics should be involved in constantly doing. That's what a matriculation is, right? So is there an individual? Even more so, once you start to communicate and behave in such a way, and you see others of the like mind bringing in the matriculation or bringing in a school of thought, Neoplatonism, Stoicism, why we have to identify different schools of thought, the difference between these schools of thought, and then even more so, how that gets into things that I talk about here, like the hieroglyphic monad, right? Where you have a symbol, a sigil, a direction, a link to each and every linear aspect and curvilinear aspect of the monad. When you look at John Dee, and how it seems like, so the idea of a really good introduction to potentially that nearly 1,000 years or over 1,000 years, over the last, we're going to say 3,700 years, has been removed, right? In other words, yeah, so I'm not going to jump tracks and start talking about this. This gets into Shalaga, um, a certain like tartan state of existence, and the fact that there is a big gap um, that occurs between what would be considered the Greco-Roman era and even medieval times. There's a lot of conjecture going on there that there's not enough history. There's some pretty crazy things, like where they actually put Napoleon and Alexander the Great, yeah, together in a campaign. I'm not expressing that, but what I am saying is that time doesn't work like we think it does. If you look down at the community posts, you can see that I post things such as articles of peak interest in particular fields, such as one that I put down below a few days ago dealt with time being reversible in glass, right? And of course, if you're like me and you get a little bit ADD and you start trailing off on things, you start thinking, well, the glass firmament, that's of a biblical nature, right? But you get into the bibliography of why have such an agenda? Why did the Council of Nicaea exclude so much? Why was it so heavily based on, why was Enoch excluded? And I believe that a lot of the things that Billy Carson talks about are right on. But I think that he's very safe also in the conjecture that he brings up, as to say that, okay, we're going to talk about things in depth, but on a surface level where we're just bringing the subject matter up. We're not getting too intrinsic or detailed where we don't have the information, right? But where he kind of, I'm not going to say draws the line, but what makes his work so interesting is that he says, well, this is what it is. Like, this is what we have as the proof is, and a perfect example of that would be like the Anunnaki, right? And the naming of Marduk, right, as a specific energy source, right? Of, like, he talks about Enlil, and it's like these gods throughout antiquity that name a certain era, right, and separate these eras. It almost seems like it's too pre-planned. It almost works in too. It almost fits, and I think the perfect example would be like Angkor Wat, right? Ethiopia, which I couldn't remember the name of the other day. And I remember it being Angkor Wat, right? But it's Angkor Wat. And it's this very elaborate structure, right? But when you look at where these ancient construction field energies, let's just call it that, right? These things were built to a certain spec at a certain height, a certain distance from other global sites, that there is an energy grid or an energy system implied, right? And we start to wonder, well, where's the energy come from, right? Is it does it have to do with Meriden lines? Does it have to do with torsion field energy, as it's been called, right? Like, how do we approach this? Is this 0 point energy? And more you get back to Leonard Horowitz, who well over a decade ago was talking about such subjects and looking at things like Emoto's work on water. Here I am drinking tap water right now, and talking about how we are purposefully being poisoned and attacked, right? That pineal gland is under attack specifically so that we cannot resonate that crystalline structure, right? And that our DNA is under heavy damage all the time, that it cannot be what it was made to be, which is an antenna. Like, from what he talked about, is the solfeggio is a self-correcting measure, right? It's a self-healing measure. That if we are just given the basic constituents of what we need without all these poisons, that a self-correction takes place just from the resonant tones. And so he talked heavily about, so Leonard Horowitz used to lecture on this. The problem is that these people get old, shit, I'm getting old. You know, I'm not putting myself in such a claim. I'm just shooting the shit, talking about this stuff. It's been an area of interest of mine for a long, long time, and that's why a lot of my knowledge base is heavily dated. But I did study the shit out of this, and I have been very interested in it for many, many years. And I think that it ties directly into the Naj or Nag Hammadi. I think it ties into information with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Um, Something that Billy Carson, like I was really into reading the Emerald Tablets, Thoth or Thoth, right? Thought. Um, and you get into that whole thing where it's like, even if that wasn't a specific individual, the thought and the reincarnation, and even more so the re-embodiment, became such a thing where only a certain select few that joined up to an alma mater or a program could have direct access to this type of information. They had to be deemed as important to a particular timeline, i.e., the the blue bloods, as they used to be called. You don't hear these things talked about so much, but they circle back around and they resurface, right? Where all of these, pretty much 99% of these presidents can be linked back to some sort of bloodline. And there's books. I think David Icke used to get into this pretty seriously. There's books that, um, like, how many people are going to go in and argue with this that have the time and the resources to actually study this on their own? So you have to go into comparative analysis. You have to use the data. And this gets into like metadata or metadata sciences, where you take information that's available, you put it together, you classify an event, but then you see what was happening with Watson in his area of study in the human genome, right, project, and how they sunk a lot of money. There were times when their funding wasn't so great. It took them forever. Finally, they came up to this place where they're almost done, but they stayed there for many, many years. The book DNA is heavily based on this. It's like this exciting time, and then technology comes in and shows them all, corrects the entire thing and shows them where they were wrong, and they're still going through. And then now, just recently, very sophisticated equipment has pretty much, it's an interesting area of subject, because it shows what we could do really from a more analog point of view. Not that prior to the 2000s everything could be considered analog, but by comparative standards of today it really is, right? Because we're getting into this area that we call right now supercomputers and quantum computing, Bloch spheres, and it gets heavily into binary systems, right, that support a uh, multi-planar view of dimensions that go into more uh, parabola type of non-Euclidean spherical mathematics. And when you get into these areas of convex, concave, curvature, hopefully my audio will recover when somebody tries to call me. It completely shuts down my live. But when you get into these systems, start to see how the only way that you can understand this is you have to begin to look at John Dee's work, right? And you start to see how it's not a simple idea of dualism, meaning like a separation. Either there's a singularity or there's a separation, you know? either there's a monism or a dualism occurring there, but I conjecture that both of those are happening parallel and more. And I think that John Dee's work best exemplifies this. And I think it went over people's heads. There's a level of savant or autism involved in the preoccupation with such things. Like, for the long, how the hell does that pertain to anything? Then when you start to look at these systems, right, these on-running systems, you think of things in an epistemological way, right? But you also have to begin to see things when you see from a quantum computing standpoint, particularly non-Euclidean spherical mathematics, how sacred geometry and therefore ontology, the breakdown of sort of a plasma-based metaphysical energy that manifests, right? So there's something else that happens there. There's a suspended notion. There's even the notion that there's nowhere for information to be stored, right? In our memories, our recollection, and that water itself holds the memories. And so if you were to just postulate that and conjecture that, right, as being at all viable, you'd begin to see what an assault it is to mess with our water supply when it's so easy to pass tap water through an ultraviolet. I'm not going to say. I'm going to use the word purifying, because we think of things in terms of needing to be bleached and restored, right? That's the whole thing with shelf life, rice, right? The things that cause pellagra, beriberi, all sorts of other terrible diseases. And then a small amount of nutrition is just added back in. Why reinvent the wheel when something is made so perfect? So getting something back to its pure and perfect crystalline structure. And down below, there are many links of all of these subjects and the people that have pioneered and revolutionized this to the point where what's our job? Our job as individuals is to bring this information together collectively. And I believe from one standpoint to meditatively use the 6 spheres, the water molecule, the perfect crystalline structure, Metatron's cube, if you will. And it's something that I've been doing for over the past. And it seems like from a capitalistic standpoint, or even particularly a feudalistic point of view, if you go back prior to, you start to see things like, I ain't got time for that shit. And it's like, at this point, you're going to have to make time for it, because it's here whether you like it or not. It really always has been here. It's about your own personal development. It's about your understanding of this, but it's about what I was talking about some moments ago, where you gain the efficient ability to be able to do multifarious tasks. You're running, you're thinking, you're doing, you're running a business while you're doing this. And one area of interest doesn't highlight or eclipse another. Everything has to be done on a multifarious scale. We're more than capable of doing that. And that's us being CEOs in our own lives and our own lifetimes. Peace be with you.